Hi. I just finished migrating a big project to Swift 4 last week, so, how are you doing? It was one of those mixed Swift Objective-C projects, and there's like a fork in the road. You can choose to do the explicit Objective-C interface, or you can use the old Swift 3 behavior. So I want to do the right thing, but if you have a lot of Objective-C interface, it turns out to be a lot of work. So just so you know, it's a choice you can make. All right. Thank you for coming today, and everyone else too. So I'm Sean Coleman. I'm a technical architect at Possible Mobile. And I'd like to talk a little bit about my role before we get started. Technical architect, the word architect really resonates with me the most. The technical is just decoration. And as a technical architect, my job is to sort of be aware of developers struggling with big problems, and then I swoop in, and I help them solve those, maybe whiteboard a little bit. And then once I feel good about things, I leave and I'm out fast. So we started having directors at work. And we added a director of delivery. Our shop's getting bigger. We have a director of talent. And so I went to my team and I said, could I be your director? But I didn't have a title, so I work on airline apps. And we came up with director of Dirigibles. So I'm the director of Dirigibles at Possible Mobile. As a director, I read a lot of other people's code, do code reviews. I'm kind of like the gatekeeper of the code base. One of my first initiatives as director is to make sure that we have a healthy code review environment. I want it to be feel really safe. And by that I mean safe for the reviewer to make honest comments about code. It's critical that you don't hold that inside. You don't want that to fester. You got to get that out. Okay, so today I'm talking about typography and adaptive layouts in iOS 11. We'll cover four main topics: inclusivity, typography, and we'll hopefully draw some connections between those two. And then we'll look at some code and look at how dynamic type APIs work and how we can build adaptive layouts around dynamic type. A bit of housekeeping first. I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of someone that works on big teams. So I work with designers and developers and client partners and things like that. But if you're an indie, you're wearing all the hats. So please make the adjustment. And if I say, talk to your designer, assume I mean put on your designer hat and talk to yourself. I'm not a wizard or anything. I'd be disappointed. First, let's talk about inclusivity. Inclusivity is this idea that we as creators embrace all users and give them the best experience that we can. Apple's position is that accessibility is a natural, integrated part of iOS. And Apple views accessibility as a competitive advantage. You see that with their communications. When they talk about the watch, they talk about how it's an accessible wearable more than any other. And you'll also hear that it's the right thing to do. And we can take that position in the apps that we build. To set the tone and to show you how Apple feels about accessibility, I'd like to play a short clip of one of their accessibility videos.
People think that having a disability is a barrier. But that's not the way I see it. You can catch up with friends. You can capture a moment with your family.
One face, small face, focus lock.
Alright, so we finished there with voiceover. You can finish that video on apple.com/accessibility. Apple categorizes accessibility into these four: vision, hearing, physical, and motor particularly on font adjustments. Did you know about 4% of the population has low vision? And at age 40, a lot of people develop a form of age-related farsightedness called presbyopia. And that's the thing, where your arm is just eventually isn't long enough to hold the device away from your face so that you can read the text. And they actually don't hold it down here. Out here, they usually hold it down here because it's a little bit less conspicuous. The fastest growing segment of the population is people 60 years and older, so those are our users. And 50% of those people have some sort of visual impairment. Low vision isn't binary. There's a continuum of visual capability between 20/20 vision and blindness. So where voiceover might be indicated in one end of that continuum, there are other solutions that are indicated in the rest of it. So those are our users. Those are our friends, our parents and grandparents, and ourselves, if not now on some timeline. When we design inclusively, we're designing for everyone. Font adjustments describes a user-facing feature in settings. And by default, we get 7 settings, and then if you toggle the switch, you can add 5 more. Also, with iOS 11, there's a new Control Center control. So if you swipe up in Control Center and you have that control added, you can touch that control and quickly adjust font sizes on your apps. And it's really nice to survey the landscape. If you don't need them on all the time, you can test apps really fast that way. So I invite you to use that control and sort of take a look around our community and our third-party apps. Apple's riding the ship with apps like Music there, where they're redesigning the interface to allow for dynamic text. And they're making choices. Sometimes they're truncating, like if you can tap through and see the rest of content, maybe that's the right choice. So they're going through with apps like Music and Calendar and sort of fixing what they've identified as a problem in the system. Meanwhile, most third-party apps don't react to dynamic text at all. I watched a lot of tennis this year, and I watched Wimbledon, and the Wimbledon app, for instance, doesn't react to size changes, so that's what it looks like at the largest accessibility size. And this is what these apps might look like to low vision users. With the Music app, you can still read a moon-shaped pool. It's not easy, but you can read it. But with the tennis app, with Wimbledon, you can't read the scores anymore. Text size adjustments are really important for a lot of our users. Before we dig into the technical aspects of wrangling type on iOS, let's recap how we got here with a brief history of typography on the Mac and the iPhone. Anyone recognize that? Segment our audience here. That's MacWrite in 1984. So it says, words can be emphasized by changing fonts, changing styles, and changing sizes. Design typography, digital typography has a rich history on Apple's computers, and Apple liberated typography from the confines of type design studios and print shops with the introduction of the Mac and programs like MacWrite. Steve Jobs played an integral part in advancing digital typography while he was at Next, and that inspired other companies. And Apple shipped the TrueType system with the Mac System 7 in 1991. TrueType was a revolutionary type system in that it allowed for fonts to be defined with geometric shapes, blueprint, as opposed to a series of bitmaps. So that enabled text sizing. Fast forward to 2007, and TrueType is included in the first iPhone, along with the Helvetica font, a very neutral, readable font that paired well with the first iPhone design aesthetic. Later in iOS 3.2 in 2010, we got custom fonts. So designers could inject style and branding cues into their apps. So this era, this is the pixel-perfect era of app design. Designers are making designs that conform to have pixel precision, and as developers, we're matching those, right? And we're getting feedback. Like if we're a few pixels off, we're getting feedback. They're like, No. You're 5 pixels off on that. And this is also the time of the skeuomorphism design paradigm. And skeuomorphism pairs really well with pixel perfect design because you're modeling after real world objects that often have prescribed sizes. And that really brings us through to iOS 6. Meanwhile, on the web, text size changes have always been kind of natural in browsers with a simple keystroke. And in the mid-2000s, a group of designers, web designers, sort of initiated a CSS renaissance. And they were trading ideas about how to build layout around content that's changing and viewports that are changing. They wrote books and wrote articles on Listapart. And this culminated with Ethan Marcotte coining the phrase responsive web design in 2010. So while the web is working to figure out how layouts should work on digital platforms, we're still locked into pixel perfect around that time. Did you know that all iOS developers are typographers? So typography is the practice of picking fonts, choosing styles, choosing typographical features, and applying those in layouts. And so in that sense, we are all typographers. And typography is a really developer-friendly area of user interface design. There's a set of rules, and you can learn them. It's very tractable. You can learn these rules, and you can start applying them. Like you might choose here to set the text style of the time to title 2, and that the system will provide a size for that, as well as the body. We might choose to set the time, the AM in small caps and USTA for a nice touch, and to make sure our quotes are wrapped in smart quotes. And we might address the leading in our paragraph styles. So all these are very approachable, I feel like, for developers, as opposed to maybe opening up Photoshop, because we can do a lot of it in code. And this is a great place for developers and designers to meet in the middle and sort of define how an app should behave, not just how it should look, but how it should behave based on what content we have. Typeface pairing is a little bit like wine pairing. Apple recommends that an app should have maybe 1 or 2 fonts in it. Mostly they say, I think they're leaning towards 1, which is theirs. But if you decide to go with 2, you might be considering like how to pair typefaces, and maybe you'll be preparing a custom typeface against San Francisco. It can get a little esoteric in certain circles, a little snooty, but we can all participate. So here's a slab serif called Roboto slab. And my feeling is that this pairs very well with San Francisco ProText. San Francisco ProText provides a functional baseline. It's very readable and very clean. Meanwhile, Roboto slab provides some strong language of its own, some design language. It's a bold statement. Now this pairing, I feel like, isn't so great. Avenir Next is a very modern sans serif, and Baskerville is an older print typeface. And so I feel like these typefaces are at odds with each other. We have kind of like the old and the new, and especially with the placement of them, with the old typeface being used in the body, I feel like there's a tension here. I'm not sure if you feel that too. But if you have 2 whimsical typefaces that have a completely different design language that are communicating something different, and it's not aligned, there can be a clash. And I think that's what we have here with Herculean and Noteworthy. We have basically 2 different strong opinions in type that aren't cooperating. It's clashing. But you should probably use San Francisco. San Francisco is a mobile-first modern typeface that's the default on iOS now. It was designed with accessibility in mind through a collaboration of typography designers and UI kit engineers. Apple's taken the care to do things like adjust the X height at the small sizes and make it taller, and adjust the apertures, so like, in the O, the negative space, to be very big so that at small sizes it's very readable. San Francisco includes both text and optical variants in the type family. So at 20 points and above, if you've typed San Francisco, if you using dynamic type, the body text will transition into the optical variant, and you get a nice clean look in the body, very readable, but then at the larger size you have tighter kerning, tighter spacing. San Francisco is the best typeface to use with dynamic type because of these extra steps Apple's taken. So iOS was behind, and I'm not sure so much that they were trying to catch up with web, but just that I think they recognized that there was a problem. So with iOS 6, we got auto layout, enable us to write designs in a much more difficult and expressive way. And then with iOS 7, we got dynamic type, allowing users to adjust text sizes and allowing us to tie into that system. So that's been out a little while. Auto layout is almost ready in iOS 7. In iOS 8, we got auto layout is ready. We got size classes allowing us to adjust the viewport sizes, so we're catching up. And self-sizing table view shells are an important tool because we're using table views and text content is changing. Without self-sizing, it's actually quite a bit of work to make those table view cells grow, and especially to do it performantly. And for the first time, we've heard the phrase from Apple in a dubbed-up presentation, adaptive layout. That'll be the first time we've heard that. In iOS 9, we get the San Francisco font we just talked about, and also UI stack view, which is an important tool if we want to be able to adapt our layouts according to size changes. We'll show more of that soon. In iOS 10, we got automatically adjusts font, which is a property on UI key controls that allows those controls to react to text size changes without having to subscribe to notifications. So that makes things a lot easier. And we got preferred content size category added to trait collections. So now when a trait collection changes, we can know information about the user's text size preference. That's pretty important. And size classes are ready. And then in iOS 11, we get dynamic type for custom fonts. And I feel like now we're at the point where adaptive layout as a concept is really ready for general use, according to me. All right, so next, let's take a look at how dynamic type works. At its core, with dynamic type, we have text styles. And these are semantic names prescribed to different pieces of content. And so our goal when tapping into dynamic type is to match our content to these names. Apple doesn't provide a whole lot of guidance here. So, you have to decide what's a caption you want. One way to approach this might be to try to use the sizes and go back that way, but that's kind of against the spirit of it. We're not really trying to match the sizes to our designs. We're trying to sign up for this, like these semantic meanings. So when a user changes the UI content size category in settings, it gives us a new set of these sizes for each text style. And if we tap into all the things, it sometimes happens very automatically, and we'll have to write out how code to do it. Okay, so let's do a quick demo of dynamic type. So in this demo, I have type defined 3 different ways. One is with the old system font of size, and I have a title and a body label. So in this demo, we'll have 2 labels. Another is with the dynamic type, so we'll call preferred font for text style, and pass the text style title, 1, or body. And then finally, we have the iOS 11 custom dynamic fonts, where we create a font and give it a size. It's important to pick a size that makes sense for the text style because this is like the basis for all the sizing from here. So you want to consider that pretty well. And then UI font metrics allows us to return a font from a font that is tapped into the dynamic type system. I'm going to skip the system font piece here because I know you know what that does. It doesn't do anything. So we'll take that out. Okay, so here we have dynamic fonts. dynamic type. And if we select the simulator, is that the simulator? I have a hard time seeing that. No one? Yeah. And so if we start increasing our text size, you'll notice that the body and title semantic names are content is growing. And they're not growing at the same rate, right? The title is growing at a slower rate because it wouldn't make sense for the title to get super big. But we eventually want the body to be very readable, even at the large accessibility sizes. Those two labels are accommodating the text. So back here in code, one thing of note is that we're pinning the labels to each other with the baseline constraint. And it's because type has lots of decorations and things, it's really, you want to pin the baselines to each other. Otherwise, you would end up with like jagged lines. And let me show you this. The constraint equal to system spacing below, that's saying to the system, I want a system spacing constraint. System spacing constraints tap into text size changes. So basically, as the title and the body grow, they don't grow into each other. The spacing between them grows as well. And that's an important tool. And let's finish up taking a look at a custom font. Using the UI font metrics to tap that into text styles. Oops. There you are. All right, so here's a custom typeface. It's just one I found on the web. I don't know if it's a particularly great one, but it's clearly custom, and you can see that we've tapped it into dynamic type. So that's cool. Reset that back down. And so again, that's the finished product, right? We're growing text, but we're not running it into each other, and we're using UI font metrics with custom dynamic type. Okay, so on a large team, one thing that we found is it's very hard to keep people on matching the style guides. And a lot of times when you're dealing with a font and with designs, you want to pair basically a font or a typeface with color and maybe an alignment. So I think in this case, one thing you can do is sort of close over some of the complexity that is present in Apple's tools and define something like a text style. And here it's just a simple struct. One of the components I had there was Font Maker. So for me, this is just a utility that you can call make on, and you can switch on properties, like here we're switching on type, and basically build a different type, build a different font, just like we did in the last demo, but based on properties of this utility. We made this chaining so that we can build up a font maker before it generates the font. And another kind of nifty thing about it is it defers creating the font, not unlike a UI font metrics, so that we can decide when to generate it in case we want to do something to it first. So it's a little bit of extra flexibility. So we could create text styles that match designs. Like here, we're creating a dynamic type that's title 2 in bold, and the color is Blue Congress. If you deal with colors in a large app, you tend to have a lot of them, unfortunately. So I recommend using very, very descriptive names like Blue Congress and Gray Slate. That works well for us. It's very memorable. It allows us to communicate about it instead of very light blue and very, very light blue. Gray Slate body style is also there, and that's a dynamic type. It's not bold, it's a body. And the color is Gray Slate. So we'll wrap those up into static methods so that it makes it really trivial for somebody working on a feature to sort of look at a style guide and then go in code and then match that when they're building their UIs. So one challenge that you're going to run into probably, or that we do, is that style guides don't match text styles. And it's that problem where, Apple sizes might not match what your designers had in mind. That's kind of a big problem. One solution might be we can try to persuade the stakeholders. So we can try to get the messaging out early to the designers that, these are really the sizes you should be writing to, because this makes the system behave in a way that works for people in the way that they expect text to behave. But that doesn't work all the time. So another thing we could do is we could try to mess with the scale. And so we could take the system type and then try to scale it and get in there. If you do this, you want to make sure that the scale you're scaling to is pretty close to the semantic name you're trying to pair it with, because you want the scaling behavior to be matchy with that. Another thing you could do that's pretty similar is to make a lookup table, but here you're exercising more control. So you're basically saying, like, here's just a table of all the sizes, and just use these. All of these options are kind of against the spirit of text styles, though. Basically, when the user selects a text style, they're saying, I'm comfortable reading body at size 22. And if you're messing with that, right, you're basically sort of like meeting them halfway, I guess, but it's not great. Most of the time, designers and clients care about the default one. So most of the time, so if you tune that one, you could let the other ones do what they will, because they're always focused on the default one. Now let's see how adaptive layouts can be built around dynamic type. Steve Jobs says, design is not just what it looks and feels like. Design is how it works. Another Steve said, accessible design is good design, famously said this. And he's correct, so we'll allow it. For me, design is about elegantly solving for a set of problems and searching for the truest solution that improves how we experience the world. And I think it's important to thoroughly understand the problem space that you're designing for. And so an iOS design that doesn't address the accessibility aspect of the system isn't a complete solution. In the newspaper world, a print shop has the luxury of being able to place text within a grid. So something like, you probably can't see it, but the president's statement right there, right, it neatly fits in a box. But when we think about what we should do on a digital platform, we don't want to put text in boxes because it makes it very hard to answer the question, what happens when the content gets bigger. I could see this as like a pre-iOS 6 app and somebody, saying, just like reading old newspapers, but on your phone, 5 stars, right? Like in the skeuomorphic time, maybe this was satisfactory. Probably not, but so don't box in your content. We're not designing for the printing press. And this requires a fundamental change in design thinking. We're not looking at a static picture anymore. We're considering a behavior. So there's a behavior component that if we're not designing for it, we're not addressing the problem. When designing adaptively, it's important to engage in some design exercises. And these can be fun, actually, or at least I think they're fun. Like what happens when the viewport changes and you have to, tap into size classes? Or what happens when content exceeds its container? The newspaper example. Or what happens when text increases via dynamic type? What text should grow? So it may not be true that all the text should grow, right? Like sometimes we have supporting content and that's just really noise or something like, that the client needed in there but isn't really important to the user. So, separate the signal from the noise and try to make the signal grow, but maybe leave the noise out of it. Does the layout need to change? So, sometimes it makes sense to change the layout in response to text size changes. So let's do one of those exercises. What happens here if the text size increases with the names? Anyone make a guess? Truncate, right? So probably, one answer to this problem would be to truncate the text. And that might be okay if there's a tap through where the rest of the content is available, and this is just, just a piece of communication that leads people to other content. But what if we didn't want to truncate? What if we wanted to preserve the player names? Any ideas for how we could solve for that?
First baseline alignment, text wrapping.
Text wrapping, right. So we can start wrapping the names. And that might be a good solution. But what if I said that the score layout, the placement of the score grid, is like a canonical layout, not unlike a calendar. So for a tennis fan, there's a set score, 6, 4, 4, 6. And that layout being preserved is like it's important. Like, it's a way you can read it fast. Like, it makes sense to you, just like a calendar does when you see a grid. Right. So we can reflow the layout vertically. Whoever said that. So here we position the names above the numbers. And while it's not perfect, right? Like, we still have to make this association between Merrick and Murray's score and Novak Djokovic's score in the scoreline. Tennis fans are used to this. Like, they understand what this means. And as a tennis fan, when I look at this fast, I'm like, yeah, that's the scoreline for Andy Murray and Novak Djokovic. So it makes sense for this content. And that's an important piece of this work, is that you have to ask yourself, does it make sense for this content? We also deprioritize the line below. You can't read it, unfortunately, actually. So color contrast is also very important. But there's a line below, and we decided not to make that line grow. It was like a contrived example to illustrate complementary text. And that one, we'll just define it with the system font of size. We just want it to stay put. Okay, so let's jump out to another demo and see how that works in code. All right, so the view controller here is pretty simple. It just sets up dummy data and table view delegates. That's not really important. Is that second one matched? Okay, great. All right, so here we have a table view cell. And really, the only interesting thing that I want to show here is what happens when trait collections change. I said before that UI content size categories in trait collections. And so what we can do is when we get a preferred content size category, and they have operators for this, so you can say less than extra, extra, extra large, will deactivate a constraint because that's part of making the layout work and having enough constraints defined. But we'll change the stack view, that's the relationship between the players and the scores, to vertical or horizontal, depending on where we are in our content size category. So let's run that. And I have a tab bar, so we'll go to the second tab here. And so here are those scores at the default text size, called large. And as we walk up the content size category changes, you can see that we maintain that layout up to the point where it would break. We'd have to make a choice. So at that point, we'll reflow this layout to be vertical instead of horizontal. And we can walk back down and see it change back to horizontal. So in our storyboard, this is defined as a series of stack views. So we have the player stack view and the score stack view. And so one thing to think about as well is just think about all the tools you have at your disposal. We have the solution where we could choose to wrap text, and sometimes that's the right choice. We could also play with the scaling factors. So we could get in here and say that, like, we'll govern the scaling of one of those components up to like a maximum. And sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes if you're going to break a canonical layout, like you want to push back against the text size changes and say, no, we won't scale this font beyond this threshold. And you can do that in a storyboard really easy. I'm actually going to skip that piece because of time, but just express that it's just a setting away. So that's fairly complex behavior considering how easy that was to do. There it is again. And this is how this layout might have looked for somebody with low vision. You know, the top is the top bit of blurriness is the scale, the cell before scaling, and then the bottom one is scaled up to that largest accessibility size, and you can still make out the score line. You'd really appreciate it if you had this problem and the app you were using was designed this way. When I worked in front-end web development and did a lot of layouts, I got to this point where I could instinctively visit a web page and I could feel the badness. Like if I knew the text wasn't going to change or scale properly and that the layout wasn't going to adapt, it's like I could just feel it. You know, when you're into the practice of it, you just know intuitively that the text isn't going to, that the layout isn't going to react properly. And so as you get into more working with dynamic type on iOS, you'll just develop that same instinct. You'll download an app, and you'll sort of feel it. You know, you'll say like, all right, there's no way they address this problem in this app. You know, it's just not been done. And I think that after a while, our tastes will change, and adaptive layouts will start to feel right, and intuitive and inclusive apps will start to feel right. So build inclusively. Adaptive layouts was coined at DubDub 2014, and it usually takes a couple of years for Apple to get all the kinks worked out and get something ready to use. iOS is ready with the tools required for adaptive layouts today. If you find yourself at the end of a series of design meetings and client meetings, but you haven't had a lot of input into the process, one thing you can do is to try to just be a platform advocate and get involved in that process if you can, or do something after the fact. This is actually a real letter I wrote to a client 2 weeks ago, trying to advocate that they use San Francisco over a custom font. Some content is blurred to protect the innocent, but basically, actually what I really did was they were having a conversation about fonts, and I really had a message to get out about dynamic type and adaptive layouts ahead of like the designers doing a bunch of work. So what I really wanted to see was that they not design layouts that box in content. So I kind of rode on the San Francisco train and got my message in about adaptive layouts ahead of the design team doing work. So sometimes that's the best solution we can come up with. Other times, you know, if you can get ahead of it and actually work with designers, that's better, right? And I'd expect in a product company it's more collaborative. A little note about our practice to leave you with. I feel like the view layer of iOS is just getting more and more complex, right? Since the time of skeuomorphism and grid layouts, that was very easy. But now with size classes and dynamic type and these accessibility concerns, it's getting harder and harder to master this area of iOS and also to keep up with what's going on in core data and networking and everything else. So, you know, I think we're getting into a point in sort of our platform where it's going to make sense to have more specialists. And rather than be okay at everything, maybe, you know, we'll specialize and be better at a few things. Of course, this makes a lot of sense for the world I live in. For indies, you still get to do it all. These are some DubDub sessions that I watched that I think are really good. The middle three are great for designers. Typography and fonts, inclusive app design very well. And building apps with dynamic type is kind of like the core talk from this year that talks about how to build with dynamic type. I have some code out there on GitHub. I'm Suwan, and it's a dynamic typography repo. And I also wrote an article that was launched on our company blog last week with related content. If you're interested, that might be a good way to find some of these resources. That's all I have for today. Thanks.